Welcome to Politics for Patriots. Here's your host, the eviscerator of progressive nonsense, the executioner of imbecility, and the grim reaper of BS, Eddie Zipper.
All right, welcome to episode 84 of the Politics for Patriots podcast. If you haven't yet, please subscribe on iTunes. Also, if you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. Because remember, every time you subscribe to a conservative podcast, a liberal somewhere sheds a tear.
No, wait, let me say something.
This is going to be a very different episode than usual. There are pretty much no jokes in this episode. It is just a straight-up lesson on the Constitution and American history. An important lesson that explains why it is unconstitutional to count illegal immigrants toward House representation. Right? California has 53 representatives in the House. That is far more than any other state. But constitutionally, they should have only about 49 or 50. Their number is inflated by the population of illegal immigrants who cannot vote. People often say the Constitution says you have to count every single person as a whole number. Therefore, constitutionally, we're required to count the illegal population. That is not true. In fact, the opposite is true, and I am about to prove it to you. Okay, here's the part of the 14th Amendment that you hear all the time. The very first clause which says, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state. That sounds pretty cut and dry. It doesn't say the whole number of citizens. It says the whole number of persons in each state. How can you argue with that? That should mean you have to count illegal immigrants whether you want to or not. But guess what? There's more to it than that, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. Right now, today, the executive branch wants to ask people on the census whether or not they are citizens of the United States. The Democrats do not want this question asked, and they are fighting it as hard as they can. Even though, according to the latest Harvard-Harris poll, a supermajority of Americans, 67%, support that question being asked. What benefit is there of being against something that 67% of Americans are for? I'm about to explain it to you. They claim the reason is because the question will scare people and non-citizens will be undercounted. That is not the reason. All right, and here comes my explanation. Get ready to have your mind absolutely blown. Okay, nothing in American history is more misunderstood than the Constitution's 3/5 compromise. They teach it wrong in schools, and pundits talk about it wrong on the news. There is a narrative that it was dehumanizing to count the enslaved population in the South as 3/5, and they should have been counted as a whole number of people, each slave counting as one whole person. That is absolutely not how it should have been. We would have been able to abolish slavery sooner and possibly without a war if the enslaved population had been counted as 0. It may have taken longer if the whole number had been counted for the purpose of representation instead of just 3/5. And here I'm going to explain why for anyone who doesn't know. So first off, let's fire up our flux capacitors, travel back to the Constitutional Convention, and talk about what the 3/5 compromise really is.
I'm here to help you with your history report.
It's 1787, and the framers are creating a constitution that will unite all of the states under a strong federal government. That's hard to do because they are asking the states to concede sovereignty to a faraway government. the number one barrier to creating this Constitution, to unite all the states, is slavery. The southern states are dead set on preserving slavery. Their entire cash crop economy is based on slavery. The North is industrializing, and slavery is already pretty much dead there. So the southern states will have nothing to do with this new federal government unless it protects their precious slavery. Now, surely the South wanted the enslaved population to count as zero, right? Because it's dehumanizing to not count the whole number of people. That is wrong. The South wants the whole number of their enslaved population to count towards representation. Why? Because it will give them more seats in the House of Representatives. And consequently, it gives you more electoral votes because your number of electoral votes is based on your number of House seats plus your number of Senate seats. More seats in the House means you have more vote on policy. You have more votes, right? If you have 2 more seats, then your state has 2 more votes. And more votes means more power. It means they have to make more concessions to your state because your state holds more power. It also means, at the same time, more tax burden. And that's the reason that a compromise was able to be reached at all. But let's set aside the tax issue and focus on representation because that's what matters here. The southern states want their entire enslaved population to count toward representation. The northern states want the enslaved population to count as zero toward representation. Why? Because counting an enslaved population that can't vote toward representation artificially inflates representation for the states with enslaved populations. A state may have 5 representatives in the House without counting the slaves, but then 7 representatives if you count them. The reason it's artificial is because the slaves are not allowed to vote. They're not actually represented. So by counting them, you are increasing the power of the people enslaving them. The people who are allowed to vote, their power increases artificially. Increasing the power of those who can vote based on a population that cannot vote is actually a form of tyranny. If you are a slave at the time, a representative goes to the House and votes in a way that harms you, even though a portion of their power is derived from your existence. That is tyranny. That's the reason the American Revolution occurred. England says we're going to take advantage of the colonists' existence through numerous taxes, but the colonists are not going to have any say in the policies. That is what the southern states are doing to the slaves here. We're going to take advantage of your existence to increase our own power, but you're not going to have any say. It is tyrannical to count people who are not actually represented. That's why, and here's where we get to the good stuff, that's why the second section of the 14th Amendment says that representatives shall be apportioned according to the whole number of persons in each state. That's why we count illegal immigrants toward representation today. But what else is in that second section of the 14th Amendment that you never hear cross the lips of a pundit on TV? If a state denies enfranchisement, denies the right to vote of any group, then they cannot be counted toward representation. Now, this is a largely forgotten section of the 14th Amendment because the 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote cannot be abridged by the states on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But it's important because it shows the intent of the amendment, and it shows that lesson that was learned by overinflating the South's representation. Here's what this clause says. When the right to vote at any election is denied or in any way abridged, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state. That clause, the one you never hear, that comes right after the first clause, which you hear all the time. That clause is there to prevent states from inflating their representation by counting a population that cannot vote. Because when they do that, that portion of the population is subject to the tyranny of those that their power has been delegated to. Illegal immigrants cannot vote. Their right to vote is abridged by federal law. If a non-citizen votes, they can be fined up to $100,000 and they can be imprisoned for 1 to 3 years. Therefore, the basis of representation constitutionally should be reduced in those states. It is in the 14th Amendment, and it is there for very good reason. States like California are doing exactly what the southern slave states did. They are deriving power from a disenfranchised population. That is unconstitutional. The purpose of Section 2 of the 14th Amendment was this. At the time, it wasn't yet popular enough to say all former slaves can vote and the states have to allow them to vote. That'll be the 15th Amendment. What the second section of the 14th Amendment did was it gave us a watered-down version of the 15th Amendment. It created a political incentive for enfranchising former slaves and blacks. If you enfranchise them, then you can count them toward representation. But if you do not enfranchise them, then you cannot count them toward representation. Here's how a constitutional scholar named Garrett Epps describes Senator Jacob Howard's support for Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Howard was, at the time, like Abraham Lincoln, a Whig and then a Republican when the Republican Party came along. I got this from a really good website called facinghistory.org. All right? I favor black suffrage to some extent at least, for I am opposed to the exclusion and proscription of entire race. But the committee did not believe a suffrage amendment could be ratified. So the second section is so drawn as to make it the political interest of the once slaveholding states to admit their colored population to the right of suffrage. Then everyone forgot about Section 2 of the 14th Amendment because this 15th Amendment came along soon after and said, you know what? They're enfranchised, period. Deal with it, southern states. But the 15th Amendment does not enfranchise illegal immigrants. So Section 2 of the 14th Amendment still applies to that particular situation. If they cannot vote, then they cannot be counted toward representation. But of course they can't vote. It's against the law, so it's not... That doesn't matter. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment says, if the right to vote is denied in any way, then they cannot be counted towards representation. This clause is there to stop people who cannot vote from being used to inflate a state's representation numbers. What's happening right now? Illegal immigrants are being used to inflate certain states' representation numbers. That's why they compete for illegal population. That's why they have sanctuary states and sanctuary cities, and they want to draw illegal immigrants to their state to inflate those numbers because they take the power that it affords them to have an illegal population and they use it for whatever they want because they don't actually have to represent that population because that population cannot vote. If you want illegal immigrants to be counted towards representation, then you want them to be subjected to tyranny. All of this is why the Democrats do not want, and when I say the Democrats, I mean the party. I don't mean basic Democrats in the country, because this is overwhelmingly popular in the country to ask, are you a citizen, are you not a citizen? Only the Democratic Party does not want to ask that. The reason they do not want that to be allowed to be asked on the census, they do not want to allow the census to count the number of non-citizens living in their state, because constitutionally those people living here who are not citizens cannot be counted toward representation. What's happening right now, the way the census is being conducted, not discriminating between who's a citizen and who's not a citizen, is in fact unconstitutional. Either they can be denied the right to vote by law, or they can be counted toward representation. But it absolutely cannot be both. Counting them towards representation and not allowing them to vote is forbidden by Amendment 14, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And why? For their own protection. The increased power of the state by deriving power from that non-voting population is a form of tyranny over that non-voting population, a form of tyranny that we saw the Democrats engage in for many years leading up to the Civil War. One could make the argument that if the federal government does not include the question, are you a citizen, on the census, then the president, the executive, actually violates his oath of office to uphold and protect the Constitution. Now, nobody's going to fault President Trump for doing what the Supreme Court says that he has to do, but the Supreme Court did not have a case in front of it that made this argument that I am making right now, which is a very good argument. Although this argument probably wouldn't do well in front of the Supreme Court, because John Roberts is a coward who chooses not upsetting people over what is actually the intent of the Constitution. And you can thank George W. Bush that he's Chief Justice of the United States now. But what I have told you is a constitutional fact, which is that if a certain population cannot vote, then they absolutely cannot be counted towards representation. It is right there in the 14th Amendment, Section 2, plain as day. When the right to vote at any election is denied or in any way abridged, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state. And that's why the Democratic Party does not want anybody counting the number of non-citizens that live in any state. Okay, it's short. That's it for today, but I hope you enjoyed the show. If you have feedback, please email me at patriots@eddiezipper.com. Please subscribe on iTunes, leave a review on iTunes. That's it for today. I'm out of here.
You just listened to Politics for Patriots with Eddie Zipper. Email the show at patriots@eddiezipper.com and please subscribe.